He was just a single dad working the graveyard shift to make ends meet, but when a mysterious woman in a luxury car checked into his rundown motel, he had no idea she owned half the valley and was about to change his life forever. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain fell in a slow, steady rhythm, a curtain of gray that blurred the edges of the world and turned the flickering neon sign of the Starlight Motel into a hazy watercolor of pink and blue. The letters ST and L had burned out years ago, leaving a sign that promised only our light, a broken promise against a bruised purple sky. Leo Miller stood behind the front desk, wiping a smudge from the laminate countertop with the heel of his hand. The air in the lobby was thick with the scent of stale coffee, old wood, and the lemon-scented cleaner he used to fight back the dampness of the Oregon night. It was just after 2 a.m., the dead hour, when the world held its breath, and the only sounds were the hum of the ancient vending machine and the relentless drumming of rain on the flat roof. He leaned his elbows on the counter and stared out the large, plate-glass window at the empty highway, a ribbon of wet asphalt disappearing into the dark. Behind him, in the small back office, his daughter Mia was asleep on a cot he'd set up for her, buried under a worn quilt. Her breathing was the softest sound in his world, a quiet anchor in the long, silent hours of the night shift. This job wasn't a career, it was a necessity, a way to keep a roof over their heads, a fragile one, but a roof nonetheless. The motel's owner, old man Hemlock, paid him in cash under the table, just enough to cover the rent on their small apartment and keep food in the fridge most nights. It was enough. Some nights it wasn't. Leo ran a hand through his tired hair. His knuckles were rough, calloused from a life of fixing things that were never his own. From busted pipes to broken-down cars to the leaky faucet in their own kitchen. His hands told the story of a man who worked hard for what little he had. He glanced at the FHAWW clock, the minutes crawling by like they were wading through mud. He was just about to start his nightly ritual of checking the fuse box for the east wing when a pair of headlights cut through the rain, sweeping across the parking lot and illuminating the lobby. In a sudden, blinding white, Leo straightened instinctively, his posture shifting from weary to watchful. The car that pulled up wasn't the usual kind they got at the Starlight. It wasn't a beat-up sedan with a sputtering engine or a long-haul truck looking for DV. A few hours of shut-eye. This was a sleek black machine, silent and imposing its paint. So dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. The engine purred to a stop without a single cough or shudder. The driver's side door opened and a woman stepped out. She moved with a kind of weary grace, pulling the collar of a long cashmere coat tighter around her neck as she made her way toward the entrance. Her heels clicked softly on the wet pavement, a sharp, clean sound against the backdrop of the storm. The bell above the door chimed a hollow little sound as she stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold, rainy air with her. Leo watched her approach. She was elegant, even with her hair damp and a smudge of exhaustion. Under her eyes, her face was all sharp angles and quiet composure, the kind of beauty that wasn't meant to be friendly. It was meant to be admired from a distance. Like a piece of art in a museum, she stopped at the counter, her gaze sweeping over the worn lobby, the peeling paint on the walls, the faded travel posters from the 1980s. Without a hint of judgment, just a quiet assessment. Her eyes finally landed on him, and for a moment, he felt like he was the one being assessed. His worn flannel shirt, the fatigue in his eyes, the faint smell of motor oil that never quite washed out of his skin. He cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the quiet room. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the sudden thrumming in his chest. She offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I need a room," she said. Her voice was low and smooth like polished stone. "Just for tonight," he nodded, turning to the keyboard behind him. The keys clacked loudly as he typed. "We've got a single with a queen bed on the ground floor. Its quiet faces the woods, not the highway." "That's fine," she said. She reached into her purse and pulled out a wallet. It was sleek, black leather, with no logo, no branding, just the quiet confidence of something that didn't need to announce its worth. She slid a credit card across the counter. It was heavy, matte black, with her name etched in simple silver letters. Serafina Vance Leo swiped it, then paused. The machine blinked a green light of approval, but his eyes were on her name. It sounded like it belonged somewhere else, somewhere with chandeliers and valet parking, not here at a place that promised. Only, Arlite. He slid the card back to her with a plastic room key. Okay, you're all set. Room 12, just down to the right. She took the key, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Her skin was soft, cool, a stark contrast to his own rough hands. Thank you, she said. Turning to leave, he watched her go the long coat. Swaying as she walked out into the rain again, the sleek car door closed with a quiet thud, and the headlights cut a path back toward the row of rooms. Leo stood there for a long moment, the echo of her presence lingering in the stale air. He looked down at the registration form, her name still on the screen, Serafina Vance. He shook his head as if to clear it. Just another traveler passing through, he told himself, another ghost in the long night, but as the rain continued, steady rhythm, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night was different. The woman who had just walked out of his lobby wasn't just lost, she was hiding, and for some reason he couldn't explain. He hoped she found whatever she was looking for here, in the quiet hum of his broken-down world. The lock on room 12 was stubborn. It had been for years, a relic of a time when things were built to last, even if they didn't work properly. Serafina Vance stood in the cold rain, fumbling with the old brass key. Her fingers were numb, her mind a tangled mess of board meetings and whispered betrayals, and the hollow echo of her own voice giving a resignation she hadn't planned. She just wanted to be inside, away from the storm, both the one in the sky and the one in her head. The key finally turned with a groan, and she pushed the door open. The room smelled of damp carpet and pine cleaner. A single lamp on the bedside table cast a weak, yellow glow over a space that was clean but unapologetically worn. The bedspread was a faded floral pattern. The curtains were a shade of brown that had long given up being cheerful, and the television was a bulky box with a dial that looked like it belonged in a time capsule. She dropped her bag on the floor and shrugged off her coat. Draping it over the back of the lone armchair, she walked to the window and peered out at the rain-streaked darkness. The only light came from the motel's flickering sign, casting long, lonely shadows across the parking lot. This was it. This was her grand escape. A $200 a night cage replaced by a $60 a night one. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress sighing under her weight. She had driven for 6 hours with no destination in mind, just a desperate need for silence, a place where no one knew her name, where no one expected anything from her. She had passed a dozen pristine chain hotels with their bright logos and promises of complimentary breakfast, but something about this place, this forgotten relic on the edge of nowhere, had called to her. Maybe it was the honesty of its broken sign back at the front desk. Leo couldn't settle. He kept glancing at the security monitor, a grainy black and white feed that showed the hallway of the East Wing. He saw her struggle with the door, saw the brief flash of light as she entered her room, and then nothing. He told himself it was none of his business. She was a guest. He was the night clerk. That's where the story ended. But he knew that lock. He knew it took a certain trick, a jiggle to the left, then a firm push to get it to catch properly. He had told old man Hemlock about it a dozen times, but fixing it was never a priority. He waited 5 minutes, then 10. He imagined her in that cold room, tired and alone, assuming the door was locked when it wasn't. The thought gnawed at him, a small, persistent worry. He grabbed the master key and a small can of lubricant from under the counter, leaving a scribbled note for Mia in case she woke up. Be right back. Honey? He walked quickly through the rain, the cold seeping into his flannel, but he barely noticed he stopped outside room 12 and knocked softly his knuckles, making a dull sound against the solid wood. There was a pause, then her voice from inside, tentative, guarded. "Yes, it's Leo from the front desk, ma'am. Just wanted to make sure your door locked properly sometimes. That one sticks." The silence on the other side of the door was heavy with suspicion. He could almost feel her weighing his words, wondering if this was some small-town ploy, some invasion of her carefully constructed solitude. Finally, the door opened a few inches. She stood there, her hand still on the knob, her eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you want?" he held. "Up the can of lubricant, just want to fix the lock for you, won't take a second. I just don't want you thinking you're secure when you're not." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something he couldn't name, a flicker of deceit, a hint of an agenda. But all she saw was sincerity, tired but genuine. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. "Okay?" He knelt down and got to work, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man who knew how to mend broken things. He didn't make small talk, didn't ask her where she was from or what had brought her to a place like this. He just focused on the lock, the quiet clicks of the metal, the soft spray of the lubricant, filling the silence. She watched him the whole time, her arms crossed over her chest, her posture still tense, but her eyes had softened just a little. She watched his calloused fingers deftly manipulate the old mechanism, watched the focused line of his brow, the quiet competence in his every move. It was a small thing, a meaningless gesture in the grand scheme of her life, but no one had offered her that kind of simple, unsolicited care in a very long time. He stood up and wiped his hands on the back of his jeans. "Try it now," he said. She closed the door and turned the key. It clicked into place with a satisfying thud. Solid, secure. She opened it again and looked at him. "Thank you," she said. And this time, the words felt different, heavier, more real. It was nothing he said with a small shrug, just part of the service, but they both knew it was more than that. It was a moment of kindness in the middle of a storm, a small light in a place that had forgotten its own name, and as he walked back to the lobby, Seraphina Vance stood in the doorway of room 12, and watched him go, a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest, a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been missing, until a stranger with tired eyes and gentle hands showed up to fix a lock she hadn't even known was broken. The hours after Seraphina's check-in bled into one another, a slow procession of silence and rain. Leo returned to the lobby, his mind replaying the brief encounter in the hallway of room 12. Told himself he was being foolish, getting caught up in the mystery of a guest who would be gone by morning, but her eyes, the guarded vulnerability in them, had struck a chord deep inside him. He knew that look, it was the same one he saw in the mirror on his worst days, the look of someone holding it all together with sheer force of will. He refilled the coffee pot, the dark liquid bubbling with a low hiss, and poured himself a cup. It was bitter and thin, the kind of coffee that was more about warmth than taste. He sat on the stool behind the counter and took a sip, letting the heat seep into his cold hands. From the back room, he heard a soft rustle, and then the patter of small feet. Mia appeared in the doorway, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, her hair, a tangled mess, her favorite stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. "What was that noise?" Leo smiled and set his mug down. "Just me, fixing a lock. Honey, go back to bed." Maya padded over to the counter and peered over the top, her chin barely reaching the edge. "Was it the lady in the fancy car?" Leo's eyebrows shot up. "You were awake." She nodded just a little. "I saw her. She looked sad." Leo's smile faded, slightly. "Yeah, maybe a little," he said. He reached over and brushed a stray curl from her forehead. "Why is she sad?" he sighed, running a hand over his face. "I don't know, sweetheart. Sometimes people just are." Mia thought about this for a moment, her brow furrowed in the serious way only a 7-year-old could manage. Maybe she needs a friend, she said matter-of-factly. Leo chuckled softly. Maybe she does, but it's the middle of the night, and she's a guest. We should let her rest. Mia nodded solemnly, then yawned a wide, jaw-cracking yawn. Okay, she said, turning to go back to the office. But Daddy, if she's still here in the morning, can I give her my picture of the rainbow monster? I think it would make her smile. Leo watched her disappear back into the dim light of the office, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. His daughter, with her unfiltered heart and crayon-wielding generosity, had a way of cutting through the noise and finding the simplest truth. He looked back out at the rain-swept parking lot. The light in room 12 was still on a single yellow square against the vast darkness. He didn't know who Serafina Vance was, or what had driven her to a place like this, but Mia was right. She did look sad, and as the night wore on, he found himself hoping she'd stay long enough to see a morning rainbow. Serafina couldn't sleep. She had tried everything. The breathing exercises. Her therapist recommended the mindfulness app on her phone. The mindless scrolling through articles about market trends and corporate mergers, but her mind was a runaway train thundering down a track of regrets, what-ifs. She paced the small room, the worn carpet, a stark contrast to the plush silk rugs of her penthouse. The silence here was different from the silence of her life. Back in the city there, it was an absence, a void. This was a presence, a living, breathing thing, filled with the sound of rain and the distant hum of a world that didn't know she existed. She stopped at the window again. Pulling the cheap polyester curtain aside, she could see the lobby, the faint glow of the television inside and the silhouette of the man behind the desk. He was leaning forward, his head in his hands. And for a moment she saw her own exhaustion reflected in his posture. He had a daughter. He had said her name was Mia. He spoke of her with a softness that had taken Serafina by surprise, a gentle reverence that felt so foreign. In her own world of sharp edges and transactional relationships, she thought of her own father, a man who communicated through his assistant and measured love in stock options. She had spent her life trying to earn his approval only to realize it was a prize that was never truly on the table. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table, a message from her lawyer. They've accepted your resignation effective immediately. The board is issuing a statement tomorrow morning. Serafina stared at the words. The finality of them should have felt liberating. Instead, it felt like falling. She had walked away from an empire, a legacy, her name etched on the side of buildings and on the masthead of a dozen companies, and all she had to show. For it was a room in a motel, with a broken sign and a profound sense of being utterly adrift. She let the curtain fall back into place and sank onto the bed. She wrapped her arms around herself, a futile attempt to ward off the chill. That had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. The man at the front desk had fixed her lock. He had seen her vulnerability and hadn't exploited it. He had simply offered a moment of quiet competence and then walked away. It was such a small thing. But in the context of her life, it felt monumental. She didn't know his story, but she knew he was fighting his own battles. She had seen it in the weariness around his eyes, in the way he held himself, like a man braced for the next blow, and yet he had found a moment to offer help to a stranger. She closed her eyes, the image of his kind, tired face lingering in her mind. For the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like a CEO or an heiress or a headline waiting to happen. She just felt like a person who was lost and a little bit broken, and for some reason that felt like a beginning. The first light of morning was a pale gray wash that did little to lift the gloom of the wash storm. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, but the sky remained heavy and low, as if it had forgotten how to be anything but sad. Leo was on his third cup of bitter coffee when the bell above the door chimed. He looked up, expecting a weary traveler or a truck driver. But it was her Serafina Vance. She stood in the doorway, her long coat draped over one arm. She had changed into simple black trousers and a soft gray sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a neat twist, but she wore no makeup. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with a sleepless night. She looked less like an heiress and more like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck. "Good morning," he said, his voice raspy. From the long night she offered a small nod. "Morning. I was just coming to check out." He tried to keep his expression neutral, but a pang of disappointment surprised him. He had hoped she'd stay, if only for Mia's sake, of course, he said, turning to the computer. "I'll just get your receipt printed." He fumbled with the mouse, his fingers feeling clumsy and slow. He was tired, his mind a fog of caffeine and exhaustion as the printer whirred to life. She spoke again, her voice quiet but clear. "Actually, I was wondering if you could extend my stay another night." Perhaps Leo paused, his hand hovering over the printer. He turned to face her, a question in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked, thinking of the worn-out room, the leaky showerhead in the bathroom next door. The general air of decay that clung to the starlight like a second skin. She nodded. "I slept better here than I have in months," she said. It wasn't entirely a lie. She hadn't slept much, but the brief moments of rest she had found felt deeper, more real than the medicated slumber she was used to in her silent penthouse. A small voice from the back office interrupted them. "Daddy, is that the sad lady?" Mia appeared in the doorway, her hair still wild from sleep, holding a piece of construction paper in her hand, her eyes wide and curious as they landed on Serafina. Leo's face flushed with embarrassment. "Mia, I'm so sorry," he said, turning to Serafina. "She just thinks." Serafina knelt down, her movements fluid and graceful, a genuine smile touching her lips. "For the first time, it's okay," she said, her voice soft. "What's your name?" Maya stepped forward, shyly holding out the drawing. "Maya, and you're the lady from the fancy car." Serafina took the drawing. It was a large purple monster with 7 eyes and a wide, smiling mouth surrounded by a vibrant rainbow. "This is for you," Maya whispered, "so you won't be sad anymore." Serafina stared at the drawing, a lump forming in her throat. She looked from the daybreak, colorful monster to the small girl, with the earnest, hopeful face, and felt something inside her crack open, something she had kept locked away for a very long time. "Thank you, Mia," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She looked up at Leo, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and a silent understanding passed between them. "I'll take the room for another night," she said, her voice firm, "and, if it's okay, I'd like to keep this." Leo nodded, unable to speak, as he watched the woman who had everything in the world clutch a child's drawing like it was the most valuable thing she owned, and in tine away. The quiet lobby of the Starlight Motel, something new began to take root, something fragile and unexpected, something that felt a little like hope. The decision to stay was an impulsive one, born from a child's kindness and a moment of gut-wrenching clarity. But as Serafina settled back into room 12, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had no plan, no destination, no idea what came next. She was adrift in a sea of her own making, and the Starlight Motel was a tiny, solitary island. She spent the morning trying to be productive. She opened her laptop, intending to sort through the flood of emails from her lawyers, her personal assistant, the few friends who were still brave enough to contact her. But the words blurred on the screen, a meaningless jumble of corporate jargon and feigned concern. She closed it with a snap and pushed it aside. The room felt smaller in the daylight. She noticed the chip in the lampshade, the faint water stain on the ceiling, the way the carpet was worn, thin by the door. These were the details of a life lived on the margins, a world away from the curated perfection she had just escaped, and yet she didn't feel the revulsion she expected. Instead, she felt a strange sense of peace. This place was honest. It didn't pretend to be something it wasn't. She found herself thinking about the man at the front desk, Leo. His name was as simple and solid as he seemed to be. He had a daughter he loved, a job he performed with quiet dignity, and a kindness that seemed to be an innate part of him. Not a strategy. She thought about the way he had fixed her lock, his hands steady and capable, the way his eyes had softened. When he spoke of Mia, the way he hadn't flinched or fawned. When she handed him a credit card that could have bought the entire motel twice over, he was real. In a way that no one in her life had ever been. She walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked parking lot. The world outside was gray and dreary. But inside room 12, something was beginning to thaw on the bedside table. Mia's drawing of the rainbow monster smiled up at her, a splash of vibrant color in the otherwise muted room. Serafina picked it up, tracing the crayon lines with her fingertip. A little girl she had known for less than 5 minutes had offered her more genuine warmth than her own father had. In a decade, the thought was a painful one, but it was also liberating. It was the truth, and the truth was all she had left. She taped the drawing to the wall beside the bed, a small act of defiance, a declaration that this room, this moment, was hers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a very long time she was content to simply be in the now, to let the rain fall and the world spin on without her. She was no longer Serafina Vance, CEO, she was just Sarah, the sad lady from room 12, and that felt more honest than any title she had ever held. The day shift at the Starlight was handled by a woman named Mabel, a no-nonsense widow in her late 60s, with a sharp tongue and a heart that was softer than she let on. Leo's shift ended at 7 a.m., and he usually went straight home to catch a few hours of sleep before Mia got out of school. But today, he lingered. He found himself making excuses to stay tidying the already tidy supply closet, reorganizing the rack of faded brochures. Wiping down the coffee machine for the 3rd time, Mabel watched him from her perch behind the counter, a crossword puzzle spread out before her, her eyes sharp over the rim of her reading glasses. "You're fluttering around like a moth in a jar." "Leo," she said. Without looking up something on your mind, he stopped mid-wipe a rag in his hand. "Just tired," he lied. Mabel snorted. "You're always tired. That's a different kind of nervous energy." "What's her story?" Leo leaned against the counter and sighed. "Not sure," he muttered. "She's rich, that much is obvious. Drives a car that costs more than this whole place, and carries herself like she's used to giving orders." But Mabel prompted, her eyes still on her puzzle. "But she's also something else." He trailed off, unsure how to describe the quiet sadness he'd seen in Serafina's eyes. The way she had looked at Mia's drawing like it was a lifeline, sad eyes. And an expensive coat is a dangerous combination. "Mabel," said finally, filling in a word with a decisive stroke. "Be careful, son." Leo nodded, though he wasn't sure what he was supposed to be careful of. His own foolishness, perhaps his tendency to see the broken pieces in people and want to fix them. He thought about the way Serafina had said she'd slept better here than she had in months. It was a lie. Of course the room was drafty, the bed lumpy, and the highway noise a constant low drone, but maybe he wasn't talking about the quality of sleep. Maybe she was talking about the quality of the silence. Later that afternoon, Leo was in the small maintenance shed behind the motel, sorting through a box of rusty tools when he saw her walking. Along the edge of the woods that bordered the property, she had her hands stuffed in the pockets of her coat, her head bent against the wind. She wasn't walking with purpose. She was wandering, meandering, like someone with too much time and too many thoughts. He watched her for a long moment, a solitary figure against the backdrop of skeletal trees and a gray sky. She looked small from this distance, vulnerable, a stark contrast to the powerful woman he imagined she was in her other life. He didn't know why she was here or what she was running from, but a part of him, the part that had always been drawn to lost things, felt a strange protective pull. He picked up a wrench and turned back to his work, the metal cold in his hand. He had his own life to worry about, his own daughter to protect. He couldn't afford to get tangled in the problems of a mysterious guest, but as he tightened a loose bolt on a broken lawnmower, he couldn't shake her image from his mind. A woman with sad eyes and a secret, walking alone in the rain, and he knew then that he was already tangled the next morning. The rain finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale winter sun. The air was crisp and cold, and the sky was a vast, uninterrupted expanse of blue. It was the kind of day that felt like a new beginning, a clean slate. Serafina woke, feeling a strange sense of lightness, the heavy weight of exhaustion that had been her constant companion for months, had eased almost imperceptibly. She didn't check her phone, she didn't think about the board meeting, or the public statement, or the life she had left in ruins. Instead, she pulled on her boots and her coat, and stepped outside. The world smelled of wet earth and pine, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt the simple urge to walk with no destination in mind. She found herself drawn to the path that led into the woods. Behind the motel, it was a narrow track, carpeted with damp leaves and pine needles. The trees rose tall and silent on either side, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the ground. She walked for what felt like miles, listening to the sound of her own footsteps and the quiet rustle of the forest. It was peaceful here, away from the hum of the highway and the flickering motel sign here. The only expectations were the ones she set for herself. She came to a small clearing where a fallen log lay like a rustic bench. She sat down and tilted her face to the sun, letting its weak warmth soak into her skin. She thought about Leo and Mia, about their small, self-contained world, built on a foundation of love and quiet resilience. They had so little by the world's standards, but they had a richness. She had never known a connection that was unforced and unconditional. She had spent her life acquiring things, power, wealth, influence, but she had never managed to acquire that. She heard a sound behind her, a soft snap of a twig, and turned to see Leo standing at the edge of the clearing. He had a small thermos in one hand and a hesitant look on his face. "I saw you heading this way," he said, his voice quiet so as not to startle her. "Thought you might be cold." He walked over and handed her the thermos. She took at her fingers, brushing his again, that brief electric touch. "That sent a jolt of warmth through her coffee?" she asked. He shook his head with a small smile. "Hot chocolate," Mia insisted. He sat down on the other end of the log, leaving a comfortable distance between them. They drank in silence for a moment. The sweet warmth of the chocolate, a welcome comfort in the cool air. "You seem better today," he said. Finally, not a question, but an observation. She nodded. "I feel better this place. It's quiet enough to hear yourself think," he smiled faintly. "Yeah, it's got that going for it." They sat there for a long time, not speaking, just sharing the silence and the sunlight and the hot chocolate, and for Serafina it was more intimate, more real than any of the lavish dinners or rooftop cocktail parties she had ever attended. This was a simple moment, a shared piece of a quiet morning, with a man who didn't want anything from her except her presence. And as she looked at him, at his kind eyes, and the gentle way he held his mug, she realized with a start that she was beginning to want the same thing. The quiet companionship they found in the woods that morning began to weave itself into the fabric of the following days. It was never planned, never forced, it just happened. Leo would find her reading on the porch swing and bring her a cup of coffee. The bad kind she was starting to grow fond of. She would see him struggling with a stubborn lawnmower and bring him a glass of cold water. Without a word, they fell into a rhythm of clan. Small, unspoken kindnesses. They talked, but not about the things that defined them in the outside world. She didn't ask about his wife. He didn't ask about her business. They talked about the weather, about Mia's latest school project, about the way the light hit the trees at sunset. They talked about everything and nothing. And in that space, a fragile trust began to grow. One afternoon she found him in the motel's small laundry room, wrestling with a vintage washing machine that was making a sound like a dying animal. He was elbow-deep in its metal guts, a smudge of grease on his cheek, and a look of intense concentration on his face. "Who need a hand?" she asked. Leaning against the doorframe, he looked up. surprised, and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Unless you know how to fix a spin cycle from 1978, I think I'm on my own." She laughed and walked over, peering into the machine. "I don't know about the spin cycle, but I'm pretty good at holding things." She spent the next hour handing him tools, listening to him mutter about stripped bolts and outdated parts, and holding a flashlight steady. As he worked, he explained what he was doing in a low, patient voice, pointing out the motor, the belt, the drain pump. He didn't talk down to her, he talked to her like a partner, a student, an equal, and she found herself fascinated, not by the mechanics of the machine, but by the passion in his voice. He loved fixing things, loved the logic and order of it. The satisfaction of making something broken work again. When he was finally done, he stood up and stretched his back, aching from leaning over for so long. "Thanks," he said with a tired smile. "I probably would have just kicked it and called it a day. If you hadn't been here, it's the least I could do," she said. "You saved me from another afternoon of staring at the walls." He held her gaze for a moment, longer than necessary. The hum of the now working washing machine, filling the silence between them in that small, stuffy laundry room, surrounded by the scent of bleach and motor oil. Serafina felt a connection that was more profound than any she had ever experienced. It wasn't about witty banter or shared ambitions. It was about something much simpler and much more rare. The quiet comfort of being seen. Mia became the bridge between their two separate worlds. She adored Serafina with the quota, pure, unconditional love that only a child can offer. She would burst into the lobby after school, her backpack bouncing behind her, and make a beeline for room 12, where Serafina would be waiting with a snack or a new coloring book. They would spend hours on the floor of Serafina's room, drawing pictures, building elaborate forts out of pillows and blankets, and telling each other stories. Serafina found herself opening up to this small girl in a way she never had with anyone else. She told Mia about the big city where the buildings were so tall they touched the clouds. She told her about the time she had a pet turtle named Shelley who she had to give away. When she went to boarding school, she told her the silly surface-level stories of her life, but in telling them she began to remember the person she had been before the titles and the expectations had buried her. Mia, in turn, shared her own world with Serafina. She introduced her to her collection of mismatched stuffed animals, each with a complex backstory and a distinct personality. She showed her the secret hiding spot behind the vending machine where she kept her most prized possessions, a shiny rock, a bird's feather, and a bottle cap that looked like a tiny shield. Leo watched their burgeoning friendship with a mixture of warmth and caution. He was happy to see Mia so joyful, to see her connect with someone who treated her with such genuine affection and tenderness. But a part of him remained on guard. Serafina was a temporary fixture in their lives, a shooting star passing through their small, quiet universe. He didn't want Mia to get too attached to someone who was destined to leave. Tried to keep a professional distance between himself and Serafina, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. She had a way of slipping past his defenses, of seeing the man behind the tired night clerk facade. One evening, he was sitting in the lobby working on the motel's budget, a hopeless task that involved more creative math than actual accounting. When she came in holding 2 steaming mugs. "I made tea," she said. Setting one down in front of him, "I figured you could use a break." He looked up from the mess of numbers and receipts and offered her a grateful smile. "Thanks," he said. Taking a sip, the tea was warm and fragrant, a welcome change from the bitter coffee he usually drank. "You shouldn't be doing this. You know," she said, nodding at the ledger. "You should be running your own shop. You're too good to be working here." He shrugged. "It's a living, and it lets me be here for Mia." She studied his face, her expression serious. "You're a good father, Leo." The words were simple, but they landed with a surprising weight. No one had said that to him in a long time. No one had seen the daily sacrifices, the quiet struggles, the constant effort it took to be both mother and father to a little girl who deserved the world. He looked at her clear, honest eyes. and felt a wall inside him begin to crumble just a little. "I'm trying," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I know," she said softly, and in that quiet moment he realized that he was no longer just the night clerk. And she was no longer just the guest from room 12. They were two lonely souls who had found an unexpected harbor in the most unlikely of places. As the days turned into a week and a week into two, a quiet routine settled over the quiet routine. Starlight Motel. Serafina's presence became a familiar part of the landscape, like the faded floral bedspreads or the buzzing ice machine. She was no longer just a guest, she was a fixture, a piece of their small world that had started to feel indispensable. The unspoken question of her departure hung in the air, a silent ghost that neither Leo nor Serafina dared to acknowledge. They existed in a bubble, a temporary pocket of time where the outside world, with its demands and its deadlines, didn't exist, but they both knew it couldn't last forever. The first crack in their fragile peace came in the form of a sleek black town car that pulled into the motel parking lot. Late one afternoon, it was a car that screamed money and power, a stark contrast to the rust-dusted pickup trucks and family minivans that usually occupied the spaces. A man in a sharply tailored suit stepped out, his face a mask of polite impatience. He walked directly into the lobby, his eyes scanning the room with a dismissive air before landing on Leo. "Serafina Vance," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. "I'm here to see her." Leo's stomach tightened. He had known this moment would come, but he wasn't prepared for the cold reality of it. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice calm and professional. The man looked at him as if he were a piece of furniture that had dared to speak. "It doesn't matter. Just tell her. Arthur is here." Leo picked up the phone and dialed room 12, his hand steady. Despite the sudden tremor in his chest, "There's a man here to see you, an Arthur," he said, his voice low when she answered. There was a long pause on the other end. A silence. So heavy. He could almost feel the weight of it. Then her voice a whisper. "Tell him I'll be right out." When she walked into the lobby a few minutes later, she was transformed. The soft, vulnerable woman he had come to know was gone, replaced by a polished, composed stranger. Her hair was pulled back into a severe knot. Her face was a neutral mask, and she wore a blazer that looked like it was spun from steel. She didn't look at Leo as she passed him. Her eyes were fixed on the man in the suit. "Arthur," she said, her voice cool and distant. "What do you want?" "The board is concerned," the man replied, his tone equally chilly. "You've been gone for 3 weeks. With no communication. We need you back." She laughed, a short bitter sound. "You don't need me. You need a scapegoat. Let's not do this. Here, Serafina," he said, his eyes flicking toward Leo with unconcealed disdain. She followed his gaze, and for a moment her mask slipped. She looked at Leo, at his worried face, at the way he stood protectively near the office door where Mia was playing, and he saw a flicker of the woman he knew. The one who made tea and told stories and laughed at a child's drawings. But then it was gone, replaced by a cold resolve. "I'll be in touch, Arthur," she said, dismissing him with a wave of her hand. "Now leave." He hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked out the door, shutting with a quiet click that echoed through the silent lobby. Serafina stood there for a long moment, her back to Leo. He didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. The spell had been broken. The outside world had found them, and it had come to claim her. The silence in the lobby after Arthur left was a living thing. Thick and suffocating. Leo could hear the faint sound of Mia humming in the back office, a stark contrast to the storm that had just swept through their quiet world. Serafina stood with her back to him, her shoulders rigid, her hands clenched. At her sides, she looked like a statue carved from ice. Beautiful and unreachable. Leo wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort to bridge the sudden chasm that had opened between them. But the words wouldn't come. He was just the night clerk, a man who fixed broken things. He didn't know how to fix this. Finally she turned her face, was pale, her eyes dark with a pain she was trying desperately to conceal. "I'm sorry you had to see that," she said, her voice brittle. Whisper. "It's none of my business," he replied, though they both knew that was a lie. It was his business. Now her world had bled into his and stained everything with its cold, complicated colors. Who was he? She asked. Not a question, but a challenge. "Tell me what you think." Leo hesitated. Then he spoke the truth. "You're someone who's running from something so big it followed you to the middle of nowhere." Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. "You have no idea." She walked to the window and stared out at the parking lot where the black town car had been just moments before. "That man Arthur. He works for my father, or rather for the empire my father built. I was supposed to be the heir, the one to take over Vance Industries. But I walked away." Leo said nothing. He just listened, letting her words fill the empty space. "I was tired of the lies, the politics, the endless game of pretending to be someone I wasn't. I just wanted to be invisible for a while. And you came here," he said. She nodded. "I saw the sign, Arlight, and it felt right, broken, but honest. But now they've found me, and they won't stop until they drag me back." He could hear the despair in her voice, the weary resignation of someone who had fought a long battle and was on the verge of surrender. "What are you going to do?" he asked softly. She turned from the window and looked at him, her eyes pleading for an answer. "He didn't have. I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know how to fight them anymore." And in that moment, Leo saw her not as a billionaire or an heiress, but as a woman trapped in a gilded cage, a woman who had forgotten the strength of her own wings. He walked over to her and stopped, just a few feet away. "You don't have to fight them alone," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "But you don't know them. You don't know what they're capable of. I know what I'm capable of," he said. "And I know that you are stronger than you think you are." He didn't touch her. He didn't offer empty platitudes or false promises. He just stood there, a steady presence in the midst of her chaos. And for the first time since Arthur had walked through the door, Serafina felt a tiny spark of defiance ignite within her. Maybe she had been running, but she wasn't defeated. Not yet. The confrontation with Arthur shattered the illusion of their isolated world. The bubble had burst, and the cold reality of Serafina's life came crashing. In the days that followed were tense and quiet. Serafina retreated into herself, spending long hours in her room on the phone, her voice a low, urgent murmur of legal jargon and frustrated sighs. Leo gave her space, but he could feel the shift in the air. The easy camaraderie they had built was replaced by a strained formality. She stopped joining him for coffee in the mornings. She stopped visiting with Mia in the afternoons. She was a guest again, a woman with a problem he couldn't solve. Leo tried to focus on his work, on Mia, on the familiar rhythms of his life, but Serafina's presence was a constant low hum. In the back of his mind, he worried about her. He saw the shadows under her eyes deepen, the way her shoulders were permanently hunched in a posture of defense. He wanted to help, but he felt powerless. He was a motel clerk with a broken-down car and a handful of dollars. To his name, she was a woman, fighting a multi-billion-dollar empire. What could he possibly offer? One evening, he found her sitting on the porch swing, staring out at the darkening sky. She had a phone pressed to her ear, but she wasn't speaking. She was just listening, her face a mask of weary defeat. He waited until she hung up, then walked over and sat on the steps below her. "They're trying to force me out," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "They're using a morality clause in my contract, claiming my disappearance has damaged the company's reputation. They want to strip me of my shares, my inheritance." Everything. Leo listened, his hands clenched into fists. "It's not about the money," he said, his voice a low growl. "It's about control." She nodded. They can't stand that I walked away, that I chose a life they couldn't understand, so they're going to burn it all down to prove a point, and what are you going to do?" he asked. She let out a long, shaky breath. "I'm going to fight them," she said, but he could hear the doubt in her voice, the fear that she was fighting a losing battle. He stood up and looked down at her, his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. "Then you're going to need a better lawyer," he said. Her lawyer was a slick corporate shark, a man who was more concerned with billable hours than with justice. Leo knew a guy from his old life, a scrappy public defender, who fought for the underdog with a passion that bordered on obsession. He was a long shot, a Hail Mary, but he was all Leo could offer. He pulled out his phone and made the call, and as he spoke into the receiver, Serafina watched him. Her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning sense of hope. He wasn't just offering advice, he was offering a piece of his world, his trust, his loyalty. And in that moment she realized that the greatest asset she had in this fight wasn't her name or her money, it was the quiet, unwavering strength of a man who refused to let her face the storm alone. The arrival of Samuel Jones was a study. In contrasts, he pulled into the Starlight's parking lot in a dented Honda Civic that looked like it had survived a war. Its engine sputtering a cloud of blue smoke, he wore a rumpled suit that had seen better days, a tie that was slightly askew, and a pair of glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. But his eyes behind those glasses were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. He was Leo's friend from a former life, a man who had represented him in a custody battle years ago, and won it with sheer grit and a brilliant legal mind. He was the David to the Goliath of Vance Industries, and he looked entirely out of place in this high-stakes drama. He met Serafina in the motel's small makeshift conference room, a glorified storage closet with a folding table and a few mismatched chairs. She was dressed in her power suit, a shield of expensive fabric and sharp lines. He was holding a battered leather briefcase that looked like it was held together with duct tape, and hoped she laid out the details of her case. The complex legal documents, the veiled threats from the board, the intricate web of corporate bylaws designed to trap her. He listened intently, nodding occasionally, asking a pointed question that cut through the legal jargon to the heart of the matter. When she was done, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "This isn't about a morality clause," he said, his voice calm and measured. "This is about a hostile takeover. They're using your absence as leverage to push you out and consolidate power." She nodded. "That's what I figured, and your lawyer, he's playing both sides, milking you for fees while negotiating a settlement with the board that benefits everyone but you." Serafina's jaw tightened. "I suspected as much." Sam smiled, a wry, tired smile. "You need to stop playing defense," he said. "You need to go on the offensive. They think you're a runaway heiress, a flighty girl who couldn't handle the pressure. You need to show them they're wrong. You need to show them you're your father's daughter, a fighter." He laid out a strategy, a bold, audacious plan that involved a proxy fight, a press leak, and a direct appeal to the minority shareholders. It was risky, reckless. Even her corporate lawyers would have called it insane. But as he spoke, Serafina felt a forgotten part of herself stir to life, the part that had built a marketing division from scratch, the part that had stared down competitors, and won the part that had never backed down from a fight. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a queen, planning her return to the throne, and it was all thanks to a small-town lawyer with a rumpled suit and the unwavering belief of a man who saw her not as a damsel in distress, but as a warrior ready for battle. The fight was brutal and public. Just as Sam had predicted, the media descended on the Starlight Motel like vultures, turning the quiet parking lot into a chaotic circus of satellite trucks and reporters shouting questions. Serafina became a prisoner in her own room, her face plastered across every news channel and gossip website. The narrative was cruel and swift. She was portrayed as an unstable heiress who had abandoned her responsibilities, A spoiled rich girl playing at being a commoner, they dug into Leo's past, painting him as a down-on-his-luck opportunist, taking advantage of a vulnerable woman. The motel was described as a seedy hideaway, a symbol of her fall from grace. Leo tried to shield Mia from the worst of it, but it was impossible. The whispers followed them to the grocery store, the stares from other parents at school, pickup, were like tiny daggers. Mia grew quiet, her bright light dimming under the weight of the unwanted attention. One night, Leo found her sitting on her cot, her rainbow monster drawing clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. "They're saying mean things about Sierra on the TV," she whispered. "They're calling her names." Leo sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms, his heart aching with a helpless rage. "Sometimes people are cruel, because they're scared," he said, his voice thick. "They don't understand her, so they try to tear her down. But we know the truth, don't we? We know she's kind and brave." Mia nodded, burying her face in his shoulder. "But I miss her." Leo knew what she meant. Serafina had been locked in a war room with Sam for days, strategizing, making calls, fighting a battle that was a world away from them. They saw her only in fleeting moments, a shadow passing in the hallway, a tired face in the Prue's window. The motel had become a fortress, and they were on the outside looking in. The strain began to show on everyone. Leo felt the distance between him and Serafina growing, a chasm filled with lawyers and reporters and the ghosts of their two separate lives. He started to wonder if he had made a mistake, if by trying to help her he had only dragged himself and Mia deeper into a world they didn't belong in. He saw the toll. It was taking on Serafina, too. She was losing weight, the fire in her eyes replaced by a weary exhaustion she was fighting. But the battle was costing her everything. One evening, he knocked on her door holding a plate with a simple grilled cheese sandwich and a glass of milk. She opened it, looking surprised and grateful. "You need to eat," he said gently. She took the plate, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I forgot." He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her take a small bite of the sandwich. "Is it worth it?" he asked softly. "All of this." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I don't know anymore," she said. "I just know I can't let them win." The turning point came unexpectedly, not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in the quiet of a hospital room. Serafina's father had a stroke, a major one. The news came via a clipped phone call from Arthur, his voice devoid of any real emotion. "The board meeting has been postponed," he had said, as if that were the only thing that mattered. Serafina flew to the city on a private jet, a stark reminder of the life she was fighting to escape. She walked into the sterile white room of the ICU and saw her father lying in the bed, small and frail, connected to a web of tubes, wires. He looked nothing like the titan of industry who had ruled her life with an iron fist. He just looked like an old man, a tired old man who was running out of time. She sat by his bedside for hours holding his hand. His skin was cool and papery. She talked to him, not about the company or the board or the fight, but about her time at the Starlight. She told him about Leo and Mia, about the rundown motel with the broken sign, about the taste of burnt grilled cheese and the sound of rain on a flat roof. She told him she had been happy there, truly happy for the first time in her life. His eyes flickered open just for a moment, and he squeezed her hand weakly. A single tear rolled down his cheek. It was the most emotion she had seen from him in 20 years. In that moment, something shifted in Serafina. The anger, the resentment, the desperate need to win it all just fell away. She realized she wasn't fighting for a company or an inheritance or even for her name. She was fighting for a memory, for the little girl who had once loved her father. Before he became an empire, she called Sam that afternoon and told him to drop the proxy fight, to withdraw the lawsuits, to offer a settlement. "I'm done fighting," she said, her voice clear and calm. "I'm letting it go." Sam was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I understand. Are you sure this is what you want?" "Yes," she said. I am. She hung up the phone and looked at her father, who had slipped back into a peaceful sleep. She had lost the battle, but she had won something far more valuable. She had won herself back. She walked out of the hospital and into the city streets, feeling lighter than she had in years. She didn't I know what the future held, but she knew where she needed to go. She was going home, back to the starlight, back to the man with the kind eyes and the little girl with the rainbow monster drawing. She was going back to the place where she had learned that the most valuable things in life aren't owned. There felt the news of Serafina's surrender sent shockwaves through the financial world. The headlines were triumphant: Vance, heiress, concedes, defeat, board wins, control of empire. They painted her as a tragic figure, a fallen queen, who had lost her nerve, her fortune, her legacy. But they had missed the point entirely. Serafina didn't feel defeated. She felt free. She returned to the Starlight Motel, not in a sleek town car, but in a rented sedan that was as anonymous as she felt. She walked into the lobby and found Leo behind the counter, his face etched with worry. He had seen the news. He had thought she had lost everything. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice filled with a genuine sorrow. He believed he had pushed her into a fight. She couldn't win. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Don't be," she said. "I won." He looked at her confused. "But you gave it all up." She shook her head. "I gave up a cage," she said. "I kept what mattered." She had negotiated a settlement that gave her a small fraction of her inheritance, enough to be comfortable, but not enough to be a target. She had sold her penthouse, her collection of art, her shares in companies she didn't believe in. She had shed the skin of Serafina Vance, CEO, and emerged as simply Sarah. A woman with a clean slate and a second chance. They sat on the porch swing that night. The cool evening air, a welcome balm after the sterile hospital rooms and tense legal meetings. Maya, it was asleep inside her, head filled with dreams of rainbows and monsters. The world was quiet again. The reporters had gone, their story finished, and in the stillness, Leo and Sarah finally had the space to talk. "I was wrong," he said, his voice low, "to push you to fight. I thought I was helping, but I just made things worse." "You didn't make things worse," she said, turning to face him. "You made me remember who I was. You showed me what was worth fighting for, and in the end, it wasn't a company. It was this." She gestured to the quiet motel, the star-dusted sky, the simple peace of the moment. He looked at her, at the new lightness in her eyes, the genuine peace that had settled over her, and he knew that she was telling the truth. "I don't have a plan," he said, a note of warning in his voice. "I don't have a fortune or a fancy house. All I have is this place, and a daughter who thinks you hung the moon." She smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "That's more than enough," she whispered. "That's everything." They sat there for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast dark sky. The broken sign above them blinked its silent promise of our light, and for the first time, they both believed it. The Starlight Motel began to change, slowly at first, and then all at once it started with a new sign. The letters, bold and bright, spelling out the full name for the first time in a decade. Then came the fresh coat of paint, a warm, welcoming blue that chased away the years of grime and neglect. The leaky roofs were patched, the stubborn locks were replaced, and the faded floral bedspreads were retired in favor of crisp white linens and cozy handmade quilts. It wasn't a corporate renovation, a slick, soulless overhaul. It was a labor of love funded by Sarah's quiet settlement and fueled by Leo's hard work and unwavering vision. They worked side by side, day after day, painting walls, planting flowers, fixing what was broken and building something new. They argued about paint colors and light fixtures. They laughed over spilled buckets and crooked shelves. They fell into a rhythm of shared work and easy companionship that was more Intimate than any whispered words, Maya was their cheerful supervisor, darting between them with her own tiny toolbox, offering unsolicited advice and covering every available surface with her vibrant crayon drawings. The motel was no longer just a place of business. It was their home, a testament to their shared future. One afternoon they were standing in the newly renovated lobby, admiring their handiwork. The late afternoon sun streamed through the clean windows, illuminating the blankets, polished wood floors, and the comfortable armchairs they had found at a local antique shop. "It looks happy," Leo said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. Sarah smiled and slipped her hand into his. "It feels happy," she said. He looked down at their intertwined fingers, his rough and calloused, hers smooth and delicate, a perfect mismatch. They were from two different worlds, two different lives. But they had found a common ground, a shared dream. They had built a sanctuary not just for weary travelers, but for themselves. A place where a broken sign could be a beacon of hope. A place where a sad lady and a tired man could find a second chance at love and light. And in the quiet hum of the renovated motel, they knew they were finally where they belonged. The grand reopening of the Starlight Motel was a quiet affair. No press releases, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just a simple hand-painted sign out front that read, "Under new management and full of new." Light. The guests that evening were a mix of old friends and new faces, neighbors who had watched the transformation with curious eyes, and travelers who were drawn in by the warm glow of the new sign. Leo stood behind the new front desk, a solid oak counter he had built himself. He wore a clean new shirt, but his hands were still the same rough and capable hands that had fixed a broken lock on a rainy night. Sarah moved through the lobby with a quiet grace, a tray of homemade cookies in her hand. She wore a simple dress and a smile that was as bright as the new lights overhead. She was no longer the guarded heiress who had stumbled into their lives. She was a partner, a friend, a woman who had found her place in the crowd. World. Mia was the official greeter, dressed in her fanciest dress. She handed out her own hand-drawn maps of the motel, pointing out the best spots for stargazing and the location of the new and improved vending machine, which was now stocked with her favorite snacks. As the evening wore on and the lobby filled with the sound of laughter and conversation, Leo looked at Sarah across the crowded room. She caught his eye and smiled, a secret shared look that spoke of all they had been through, all they had built together. He walked over to her and pulled her into a small alcove by the window. The night sky was clear and brilliant, the stars scattered like diamonds on black velvet. "I love you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. She touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you too," she whispered, more than all the stars in the sky. They stood there for a long moment, bathed in the warm light of the lobby, the sound of their new life humming. Around them, they had taken a broken-down motel and turned it into a beacon of hope. They had taken two broken lives and turned them into a love story. And as they looked out at the night sky, they knew that their future was as bright and boundless as the starlight itself. The legacy of the Starlight Motel grew in the years that followed. It became a beloved landmark, a place known not for its luxury, but for its warmth, its kindness, its heart. People came from all over to stay in the simple, clean rooms, to sit on the porch, swing and watch the stars, to hear the story of the runaway heiress and the quiet handyman who had built a life together. Leo and Sarah ran the motel with a shared passion and a deep, abiding love. They raised Mia in a home filled with laughter and security, and the constant presence of a community that had embraced them as their own. She grew up to be a strong, compassionate young woman with her father's kind heart and her soulful, the mother's fierce intelligence. They eventually bought the land surrounding the motel and turned it into a community garden, a playground, a small retreat center for people who needed a quiet place to heal and to find themselves. I forgot where they had come from, the struggles, the heartaches, the long, lonely nights, but they wore their past not as a burden, but as a reminder of the strength and resilience of the human heart. One evening, years later, an old man sat on the pressed porch with his granddaughter, who was Mia's age, listening to the story of the starlight for the first time. "So the princess left her castle for a handyman?" the little girl asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Mia now, a young woman herself, sat nearby and smiled. "She didn't leave a castle," she explained. "She escaped a cage, and he didn't just fix things. He showed her how to build a new life. A better one, a real one." The little girl looked up at the sign, now weathered by years of sun and rain but still shining bright. "So it's a fairy tale?" Mia shook her head, a gentle smile on her lips. "No, it's better than a fairy tale. It's true." And as the sun set behind the trees, casting a golden glow over the Starlight Motel, the broken promise of Arlight had finally been fulfilled. It was a place of love, of light, of second chances, and it shone as a testament to the fact that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin in the most broken of places, with the most unlikely of heroes, and the quiet, unwavering power of a love that is strong enough to heal even the deepest of wounds.